Look at this photograph. Every time I do, it makes me laugh.
I'd like to introduce you to Sonia Fox-Ohlbaum and Joe Fox, brother and sister, whose parents survived the Holocaust. Joe was born in Germany after the war. Sonia was, I guess, luckier, and they've had an upbringing for a while anyway in Buffalo, New York. And I don't know if she can tell that story or not, but it's an interesting story. Sonia is a former educator. She worked with what grade?
Second, third, and fourth.
And second, third, and fourth. And for how many years?
37.
37 wonderful years in front of second, third, and fourth graders. When she quotes retired, she's now a member of the Butterfly Project Educator Group. So Sonia donates her time, along with several others, to go to classrooms, go to children, go to schools at various age levels, and present the story of the butterfly. And she's fortunate in a sense that she tells the story of her father. And I don't know if she can talk about this either, but she also brings his uniform, his jacket that he wore, and lets the children touch it and feel it. And it's really quite amazing in how that affects the students in terms of learning about the Holocaust. And Joe Fox, I guess Esquire, he's a former astute attorney who's lived in San Diego for all of his life, I guess most of his life anyway. At present, he's a member of the Yom HaShoah Committee of the Federation. And if those of you who were at the JCC on Sunday got to see some of the efforts that Joe and the team put into making that a really wonderful presentation of people. I think he's also still very active in playing sports, right? He plays softball every week. I can hardly stand up, but he's good at softball. So it's good to know. And there'll be time for questions afterwards, after the presentation. And also, if you're interested, we have a Holocaust exhibit, those of you who haven't seen it, upstairs. And I would be happy to go up and show you and present some of the stories that we have of living survivors in San Diego, as well as artifacts that are present there. So please let me know. Okay, and with that, I will allow the speakers to speak. And Sonia's first.
So, good evening. I'm Sonia Fox-Ohlbaum. I'm daughter of Holocaust survivors Nina and David Fox. I've had the honor of sharing my parents' stories, mostly my dad's, throughout San Diego County in the United States via Zoom with the Butterfly Project. And if that interests you to find out, it's thebutterflyprojectnow.com. As a retired teacher, I felt it was my obligation to fill the void that my father began after his retirement. Dad spoke for several years in school, sharing his amazing story. And here you'll see my dad when he used to go into the schools and he'd put on his jacket, his uniform. As a child, I was eager to hear the stories of my parents' lives, but was usually shooed from the room as they would say, "You should not know from horrors and sadness." My father was the main storyteller, and as I always say, had the gift of gab. My mother, as you will soon hear, found it too difficult to retell what she had experienced. I want to show the next picture too. And I hear from people all the time how their children would contact my parents, and Dad would do little ad hoc lessons at the house, and there he is, with his uniform. As my dad became older, and when he had an audience of one or more, he'd pull out these photos of himself as a young man at the age of 19, and the other a few years after the war in his concentration camp uniform, at about the age of 27. I still hear him pointing to the young David saying, "Wasn't I handsome?" Do you remember that? His audience was always mesmerized, and I'd come over and kind of signal, "Do you need a timeout?" Never did anyone want to be rescued. I decided when I write his biography, it'll be titled Old Stories for New Ears. Our father David was born February 11, 1918 in Sosnowiec, an industrial city in southern Poland. Sosnowiec was approximately 8 miles from the German border and 43 miles from the Czech border. Before World War II, there were over 30,000 Jews in his city, making up 20% of the population. Dad lived with his parents, Frometa and Joseph, along with his 4 other siblings. He barely remembers one of his brothers, Mayusz, a twin to Moniek, because he died suddenly at the age of 3. Dad was the second oldest after the twins. Next came a younger sister, Yaja, and a brother, Mendik. In Sosnowiec, his grandparents lived nearby and ran a shoe store with his parents. Dad was very close with his family, and during the difficult times of the war, he said what helped him survive was the memories of his family and the desire to reunite with them one day. His grandmother, Rivka, who he was also very close with, was a relative of the famous mime Marcel Marceau, born Jacob Marcel Munda. We never had the opportunity to meet him. Dad was very close with Marcel's uncle Robert. Dad attended a Jewish school for 7 years. Moniek, his older brother, furthered his education and attended a predominantly Polish technical school, something Dad was always very proud of. He always told us that one of his biggest regrets was that he couldn't finish his education. He made education a priority for us, his children. We all graduated from college, me with a teaching credential and my brothers with law degrees. Needless to say, he was very proud of us. Dad was very social as a young man, and when he was not out with his friends, he helped out in his family store. One store was in the city of Sosnowiec and the other in the city of Katowice. Dad belonged to a Jewish Zionist group and tells of many parties, girlfriends, riding his motorcycle, and the pride he had in his new leather jacket. He loved playing soccer, and he was the team's goalie. With his friends, they camped and traveled to neighboring cities and countries. He loved the mountains, but enjoyed the lakes from afar because he never learned how to swim. The main purpose of his youth group was to prepare for an eventual move to Israel. Dad said, "When I turned 18, I decided my future would be in Israel on a kibbutz. To prepare, we were sent to a farm to learn to be farmers." I have to be honest, I'm a city boy, and I didn't like the work. I never did earn my certificate. Life began to change for the Fuchs family on September 1st, 1939, at 6 in the morning when they woke up to Polish fighter planes that were shooting at German planes. Now, the Polish army was starting to draft the reservist, and his family became very worried. His brother's service in the Polish army was extended, and Dad was drafted. His parents wanted him to leave the country, not wanting 2 sons to be in danger. Dad had an uncle in Antwerp, Belgium, so they made arrangements for him to go to the Belgian consulate to seek papers to leave Poland. Fortunately for Dad, the Germans broke through the Polish front line, and it was now too late for him to be recruited because the Polish army was collapsing. On Monday morning, September 4th, 1939, the Nazis invaded his city. He said their entrance was horrible, with pushing, shoving, and shooting with loudspeakers, rounding up the men and forcing them to go to the train station platform. Dad's father, grandfather Jacob, and Uncle Kalman attended, but thankfully they were soon released. Dad said this was the beginning of the end. Dad's family shoe store was confiscated by the Nazis, which put them in financial disaster. Since Dad was now the oldest son at home, he knew he had to take care of his family. He was fearful of his father and grandfather being seen on the streets because of the beatings and the shootings that many Jewish males were experiencing. One of his friends was shot because he stayed out past the newly installed curfew. Dad was 20 years old, looked Aryan, being blonde and blue-eyed, and so he became the family provider and was sent to find food. The problem was money. So he sold his family items door to door to the Polish Gentiles. Later, he rode his bicycle 50 to 60 kilometers, about 30 miles, to buy onions and syrup from the farmers and then sold them on the black market. The older men, including his 22-year-old brother, who was finally released from the army, went into hiding for fear of being taken away. The ghetto was created in his city of Sosnowiec. The Germans resettled thousands of Jews from smaller towns to Sosnowiec. The great synagogue was burned, and the Jews were evicted from their homes. His family moved into an apartment with several other families. He lived in the ghetto from October 1st, 1939 until February 15th, 1940. In the ghetto, he worked for his cousin's sanitation company, cleaning up garbage, and he built bridges, roads, produced bricks, pipes, and did simple construction. His Aryan looks paid off, and Dad had an opportunity to sneak out of the ghetto to sell things on the black market and to bring food back to his family. Once he even sold his father's wedding ring for bread. Dad was arrested on February 16, 1940, and taken to Gross Sarna concentration camp in Poland, 99 miles from his home. Most of the Jews from his ghetto were taken to Auschwitz. He later learned that's where his grandparents, mother, and younger brother perished. Gross Sarna, also known as Gross Rosen, was known for its brutal forced labor, working primarily in the granite quarries. It operated as a major hub for a vast network of around 100 subcamps. Originally, it held political prisoners, but later became heavily populated with Jews that were rounded up from Germany and Poland. Along with other Jews, Poles, and Soviets, Dad received his uniform, which consisted of a jacket, pants, a cap, and wooden shoes. No undergarments or socks, and he was given the number 19454. After a short time, he volunteered to go to Frivalda, a subcamp of Gross Sarna, because he was told it was less brutal and inmates were given more food. Dad's job was in construction outside of the camp. He found the work to be excruciating and exhausting. Every day, with other inmates and a guard, he left the camp and marched through the forest. On their way back from work to the camp, there were many fruit orchards, and they were allowed to eat the fruit that had fallen on the ground. The landowner even gave them extra jobs and supplied food. Because of the landowner's generosity, he was able to give away his camp food to other inmates. On March 15, 1942, at midnight, he was taken by truck to Kitlitz, another subcamp of Gross Sarna. On the transport, he found a first aid kit. He put it on his shoulder, thinking nothing of it. Upon arrival at the camp doctor, who was only a medical student, noticed the kit and made Dad a medic, even though he knew nothing about medicine. This camp was very different from his previous camp. The inmate population had over 50,000 Jews from all over Europe. He already had the sense that this camp was going to be more difficult than the previous camp. He said, "I was living in Block 5 on the fourth part of the bunk. One bunk from the other was separated by 20 inches. It was impossible to breathe and move around. In the barracks, we had rules. We had to go by the rules. If something went wrong, the whole barracks was punished. Every night, something went wrong. For example, the toilets were located several blocks away, and because of the cold and mostly rainy nights in the winter, some of the men would relieve themselves by a tree. The next day, we all paid for it. Punishment was whipping and no food." His main job was to unload cement and iron from the trains. Dad volunteered in the first aid office after his regular work. It was very beneficial because he got a little extra food and had access to needle, thread, and scissors. That will play an important part a little later. The medics would help inmates with minor injuries, and he also had the job of stitching pieces of leather onto rubber. The finished product went to the camp shoemaker to make shoes. In return, he got extra bread. In this camp, he still received messages from his parents, hidden inside a toothpaste tube. His father urged him to injure himself, thinking he'd be released to go home. Dad tried to break his hand, put soap in his eye, and even poke his eye with a hot nail. His injuries were not considered serious enough to release him, but Dad eventually became ill with diarrhea and other problems from weight loss. He was too fearful to go to the hospital. He knew many died receiving minimal care. A capo, who was a Jewish inmate that was selected by the SS and generally was despised by the other inmates, was very helpful to my dad. The capo was from Dad's city, and he intervened and gave him an easier job, a bunk near the stove, and time to rest. This job was clearing tables in the officers' barracks, and afterwards they could eat the leftovers. Not only did he gain a little weight, he was also able to become acquainted with some of the guards. A few even shared food what they had received from home. But as the war was showing signs of ending, the guards became meaner and less kind. He was soon transferred into the forest to become a lumberjack. Only 5'4", it was a difficult job carrying the cut trees on his shoulders. On March 10, 1945, Dad was sent to Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany. He walked 10 to 12 hours a day for 3 months. Buchenwald was very crowded when they arrived, and he did not have any work to do. The camp was very disorganized, and they had very little food. On April 15, 1945, he was sent on a death march, a forced evacuation, to the concentration camp Dachau. The Nazis were trying to get rid of as many people as they could and cover up all their horrific atrocities. This march in the snow lasted 3 months. The men barely had food to eat and were beaten or killed if they helped others walk or stay alive. Dad said he would ask himself over and over, what had he done to deserve this? One day in the march, he noticed an inmate had escaped and the guards did nothing. He said, if he can do it, so can I. And he did. He escaped and he hid in the forest for 10 days. When he felt safe, he went to the town of Augsburg in Germany, but he was soon captured and taken to a police station. They weren't sure what to do with him, and after much convincing, they released him to a Ukrainian civilian transport. He escaped again, and on his way, he noticed farmhands in the field and begged for food. One man offered help and told my dad to hide in the barn at the farm, and he'd bring some food at the end of the day. Alex, the farmhand, a white Russian, kept his word. He hid my dad, fed him, and kept him safe until the war was over. When they parted, he gave my dad his photo, a cross, and his Bible. On his journey back home, still in his concentration camp uniform, Dad was stopped by American soldiers. They wanted proof that he was a Jew in a concentration camp uniform and not a Nazi pretending to be Jewish. Remember, he looked very Aryan. A Jewish lieutenant chaplain was brought over and questioned my dad in Hebrew. He wanted him to recite a prayer. Dad said the Shema, a prayer about devotion to God, and also responded in Hebrew, I'm a Jew, and I want to go to Israel. Convinced his story was true, he was sent on his way with papers to protect him. On his journey home, Dad tried to go to cities where relatives had once resided. He found no one, but learned from an old friend that none of his immediate family had survived. He never knew what really happened to them. In 2009, my brother Joe found records from the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington that Munich, his older brother, had survived until October of 1945, but perished in Buchenwald. Researching the family, I found that Munich and his father paralleled Dad's camps. They were in the same camps at the same time. They never saw each other. With this loss, he made the decision to go to a displaced persons camp, the closest being Zalsheim. He didn't reside in Zalsheim. He said he didn't want to go back to another camp setting. Instead, he was placed in a makeshift dormitory in the city of Frankfurt, Germany, with 26 other young men, Jewish young men. My dad would smile when he told me this part of the story. One day in the early morning at 6 a.m., there was a knock at my door. I got out of bed and I went to the door. I opened the door and I saw 3 girls and 1 boy. They had just arrived from Bergen-Belsen, the British zone, and were searching for their family. Since they heard young people were living where I was, they were knocking on all the doors. I invited them in, but had no news for them. I did become interested in one of the girls, Nina. And I noticed she needed new shoes. Nina was also in Zolsheim DP camp and later decided to stay in Frankfurt. Dad did buy her new shoes, and she became his wife on April 14th. Oh, I never thought about that. Yeah, wow. So I have Dad's uniform. So this is what my dad wore for 5 years. He slept in it, he worked in it. It never got washed because he said he barely had an opportunity to wash himself. It wasn't until after the war when he married my mother. She wanted to throw it away because it brought back such horrible memories. And he refused. He said, no, I want to keep that. And so she washed it. The pants fell apart. All that remained was the jacket and his cap. So remember I told you as a medic he had access to needle and thread and all of that? So sad to say, when inmates passed away, they would take parts of their uniform. And so Dad made, these are all hand-stitched pockets. And you can tell the difference in the colors, that some are a little bit faded, more purpley. And this, you can see the original color of the uniform was a much darker blue, and see the contrast. So that tells me whoever uniform that was probably worked out in the elements. In Poland, it gets very cold, it gets very rainy, and so that was that. Whereas Dad, not so much so. So I asked him, well, first, his number, 19454, that's what you see up here in the red. And so he had to have that on his uniform. So I asked him, why pockets? He said, well, I might be able to store my bread and eat it there a little later, or I might find some other food, or who knows, I might find something of use or something of importance to me. Well, he did. One day he found a spoon, and he didn't want to keep the spoon. And if you've ever seen a European spoon, they're heavy, they're bigger, and the actual soup part is much, much larger. So he made a hole on the inside of his jacket, and that's where he kept the spoon. And he used to say that when I got my ration of soup, which came in a bowl, and we would consume it like this, and the soup could be watered down, rotten vegetables. He said, boy, you were lucky if you ever found a piece of meat. He said, I would take my rations of soup, I'd go somewhere where the guards didn't quite see me, and I'd pull out my spoon, and he said, I ate like a normal human being. He said it was the one time during the day that he had felt like he had some dignity. So I take this into the classrooms, and I let the kids touch it with 2 fingers. And I tell them, you're now the witnesses. And when we talk about Holocaust deniers, we talk about all the things that they say. And I said, but you're now the witnesses. And you can tell people you've touched a real Holocaust uniform and you met somebody who's a daughter of survivors. Thank you for being such a good audience.
Good evening. My name is Joseph Fox, the son of Holocaust survivors David and Nina Fox. I was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1948, where my parents met and married after surviving the Holocaust. Today I'm here to share my mother's story, a story of unimaginable loss, endurance, and the will to survive. This is my mother in Frankfurt, as Sonia told you that she was there later. My mother hesitated for years to speak about what she experienced. The horrors were too gruesome, she felt, to be believed. But when she gathered with other survivors, they spoke openly, knowing that everyone in the room had witnessed the same death and hatred. In time, she began to keep detailed notes because she understood she had a responsibility to share what she remembered. It was very difficult for me, but I had to write it down, she said, before my memory faded away. My mother, Nina Grudniak, was born on April 2nd, 1926 in Kozienice, Poland. Kozienice is located in central Poland. Kozienice had a population of approximately 5,000 Jews before the war. She grew up with her grandmother, mother Sarah, 2 sisters, Rose and Fela, and 2 brothers, Haskell and Srulik. Her father, Joseph, and by the way, if you remember, my father's father was Joseph and my mother's father was Joseph, so that's how I became Joseph. He had previously passed away. Her family ran a small variety store, and most of them worked in the business together. Nina attended public secular school for 6 years. After public school, she attended a Jewish girls' school. At school she spoke Polish, but at home they spoke Yiddish. After the war began in 1939, there was no more school. None of her family survived the Holocaust. Nina was just 13 years old when the Nazis invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Her world was shattered. Almost immediately, she witnessed Jews being rounded up, forced into labor, and executed. She saw Polish prisoners, including Jewish soldiers, being rounded up. They were taken to a local church. She and her cousins brought them food. Then one day, the Polish soldiers told her all the Jewish prisoners had been taken away and killed. In 1940, she witnessed one of Kozienice's synagogues burned to the ground on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, one of the holiest days of the Jewish year. One Friday night, Nazis stormed her home. They smashed everything on the family's dining table and then took the tables and chairs. And while this happened, her brothers were hiding under their beds. In 1941, Nina and her family were forced from their home into the Kozienice ghetto. They were required to wear armbands and yellow stars, and they left most everything they owned behind. Inside the ghetto, which consisted of 3 streets, was packed with thousands of Jews. Every day, more people were brought to the ghetto from Warsaw, Radom, and Kielce, and other small towns. Everyone in the ghetto took the new people in. A strict curfew confined everyone indoors after 5 p.m. Food was desperately scarce. Families sold their remaining belongings to eat. Nina's family was fortunate to have a connection with a local bakery which gave them bread. Her sister Fela, then 18 years old, left the ghetto one day to sell clothes for food. She never came back. On September 27, 1942, the Kozienice ghetto was liquidated. 13,000 Jews were deported to Theresienstadt concentration camp. In 1942, Nina, her mother, sister Rose, and brother Srulik were taken to labor camps in Poland. Before they left, Nina's mother gave her photographs, pictures of family members in England, Belgium, and Israel. Those photographs would later be taken from her. The 4 of them were taken to Kruzhin. My mother was later taken to Kanapka. At the camps, Nina dug ditches and planted trees under brutal conditions. My sister got a photograph from the U.S. Holocaust Museum, not knowing who was in it, and when we received it, realized that the woman on the far left with the green circle was my mother. From the labor camps, she was sent to work in ammunition factories, first Szarzysko, then Pionki. She described Szarzysko as hell. It was an ammunition factory where the Nazis murdered tens of thousands of Jews. Most prisoners were killed upon arrival at nearby killing sites. Nina witnessed SS guards tearing babies from their mother's arms. "I will never forget the screams of those babies," she said. Guards kicked prisoners with steel-toed boots. Many, especially boys, suffered broken ribs. There were no doctors and no emergency care. She even witnessed the rape and murder of Jewish girls by the SS guards. The prisoners who were kept alive were those with useful skills: doctors, electricians, tailors, and cobblers. Nina worked 8 to 16-hour days, walking 4 miles to and 4 miles back from the factory. Workers handled toxic materials that left their skin yellowed. Explosions were common, killing and burning many of her fellow prisoners. At Pionki, Guards forced the girls to walk across a 12-inch board for support. They used boys for target practice. Every single day, prisoners were murdered by shooting, hanging, starvation, beatings, and burning. She and the others had no choice but to stand and watch. My mother's cousins, Paul and Chai, had been at Pionki for nearly a year, and their help made a difference in her survival. She always credited them with saving her life. Paul painted portraits for the SS officers who paid him with chocolate and cigarettes. He then gave them to my mother and fellow prisoners who traded them for food. On a sweltering day in August 1943, Nina and her fellow prisoners were pushed out of the barracks and forced into cattle cars. Out of the barracks and into cattle cars. They did not know where they were going. Men and women together, packed so tightly there was no room to sit, there was not enough air, and no sanitary facilities. People screamed for their children and their families. After 3 days and nights, she arrived at Auschwitz. It was the last time she ever saw her cousin Chai. At the gate, she saw the sign, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. Auschwitz was the most infamous of the death and extermination camps. The sky was red from the ovens burning bodies. The smell of burning bodies was everywhere. The prisoners were ordered to line up. The German officers looked them over and the selection began. Nina was directed to the right. Her friend was directed to the left. The next day she learned that everyone that was sent to the left were taken to the gas chambers. The women directed to the right were herded into a large hall. There, my mother was stripped and searched. Her head was shaved. She was given a burlap sack dress, no undergarments, and marched to overcrowded barracks. The photographs of her mother, that her mother had given her, were confiscated. Inside the hall, they were lined up and registered in a book. Her name was replaced with a number, A14668. The tattoo is visible in the photograph that you see. It was tattooed on her left forearm, and she was told to memorize it. The moment that needle touched her skin, she lost her identity. One German pulled her right earring, and she felt she almost lost her ear. Every morning at Auschwitz, Nina stood at roll call in freezing temperatures, hungry, malnourished, miserably clothed, praying not to be selected by Dr. Joseph Mengele. Mengele was the SS physician who conducted horrific experiments on prisoners and personally selected victims to the gas chambers. She said he had an evil face and carried a whip. The Germans called them by their numbers to work in the ammunition factory. Nina slept on bunk shelves designed for 6 people, crammed together like sardines. One morning she woke to find that the woman beside her had died in the night. On October 27, 1944, with the Russian army advancing, Nina was loaded onto trucks with 350 other women and taken to Hindenburg to manufacture ammunition. They could not sit down in the trucks. They were so cramped. They were hungry. They began to pray as never before. She lost 10 friends on that trip. At Hindenburg, she worked 18 to 24-hour shifts. One day, exhausted beyond endurance, she fell asleep while welding and burned her chin, leaving a permanent scar. The other woman helped her, pressing cloth soaked in urine to the wound to help it heal. She survived on soup made from potato peels and a few ounces of bread. On January 16, 1944, she was crammed aboard a foul-smelling boxcar and transported to Ravensbrück, a women's-only camp in Germany. There was no room for them there, so they were put into an open truck for a 2-week journey in the cold and snow to Bergen-Belsen. Civilians passed them on the road. The women begged for food. The civilians just kept walking. Bergen-Belsen was the worst camp of all, she said, not because prisoners were gassed, but because they were simply left to die of starvation and disease, every day with no end in sight. Nina spent over a year there. 600 women were crammed into each barracks, sleeping 3 to a bunk on wooden slats with little hay. Some slept on the floor. Her diet was beet peel soup and a daily slice of bread. Prisoners scavenged through garbage for anything more. Every morning they stood for hours at roll call, while the capos, that Sonia described, called out their numbers over and over. At Bergen-Belsen, they had nothing to do, just standing for hours and hours, waiting to die. They had to endure all-day inspections, just standing in line. My mother said they lived under the shadow of despair, fearing the war would never end. One morning, after she awoke, she looked out the little window of her barracks and asked herself, "Where is God?" She made friends at Bergen-Belsen. None of them survived. Her friends died beside her, and she felt herself go numb. She noticed that those who wept died, so she refused to weep. Each morning, a half-dozen women in the barracks did not rise. Smoke rose constantly from the crematorium. In 1944, the last transport from Holland by way of Auschwitz arrived at Bergen-Belsen, and among them the family of Anne Frank, who was in the same barracks as my mother. By 1945, Nina was 19 years old. She somehow survived, but did not understand how she lived to see liberation. She was near death and suffered from dysentery and lice, and too weak to stand. She weighed just 80 pounds. On April 4, 1945, British troops liberated Bergen-Belsen. Not everyone could go out and greet the British soldiers because they were very sick. The German guards had fled. All the British soldiers saw were living skeletons. They were so shocked they didn't know what to do. The prisoners pleaded for food, and the British gave them sea rations and condensed milk. But their digestive systems couldn't handle the solid food, and many of the survivors died from that alone. In time, the British soldiers gave them showers, combed the lice from their hair, and gave them clean clothes and food. They moved the survivors to the German barracks, 4 to 8 women per room, where they slept for the first time in years on pillows. The British rounded up the German women who had worked in the camp and shaved their heads, the same humiliation that had been inflicted on the Jewish women. Nina was too ill to go out and witness it. Freedom, my mother said, brought no joy. Her entire family was gone. Her hometown was desecrated. She had nowhere to go. When Nina returned to Kozienice, she found that Jewish gravestones had been used by the Poles to build homes and pave streets. She was placed by the American Joint Distribution Committee in the Zellsheim Displaced Persons Camp. From there, she traveled to Frankfurt, where she heard a rumor that some of her family had survived. She found no one. Sonia? No. In Frankfurt, she met my father, David Fuchs, and then the next one too. They became engaged and were married in a religious ceremony on April 14, 1946. Next one. And later in a German civil ceremony on May 24, 1948. And I was born there on August 27, 1948. That November, my parents applied to immigrate to Israel, but my mother was pregnant and the War of Independence was ongoing, so they did not go. Instead, my father's relatives, the Posmantur family, sponsored them to come to America. On August 31st, 1949, they sailed from Bremerhaven, Germany, aboard the USS General Taylor, arriving in Boston and making their way to Buffalo, where they lived and built a new life. My parents raised me and my sister Sonia, who are in this picture, and my brother Fred, who wasn't born yet. In March 1955, my parents and I were naturalized as United States citizens. At the ceremony, the judge asked my father whether he wanted to keep the name Fuchs. His cousin cautioned him against it. The name Fuchs, he warned, would be pronounced differently in America. My father then asked to use its English translation from the German, Fox, and the judge granted the request, changing our family name from Fuchs to Fox. In 1957, our family moved to San Diego. Despite everything she suffered, my mother said that in 1945 she was reborn, given the chance at a new life. But the tattoo on her arm, A14668, remained a permanent reminder of the horrors she endured simply because she was Jewish. I share my mother's remarkable story of survival to honor her courage and fortitude. As a child of Holocaust survivors, it is my responsibility to preserve the truth, to ensure that future generations never forget what happened, never forget what human beings are capable of doing to one another, and how our parents survived and thrived. I want my mother's story to stand as a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of compassion for Holocaust survivors, and absolute necessity of standing against hatred, indifference, and injustice in every form, in every generation. We must never forget. Thank you. I guess we'll answer questions.
I'll tell the buffalo story, okay? So when my parents were looking for relatives, they went through the Red Cross and they found some distant relatives. They found one in Buffalo, New York, and one in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. When the relatives were corresponding with my father, the return address for Philadelphia was Philly, PA. Buffalo, NY. So my father was going around going, should I go to Pilipa or should I go to Buffalo? And everyone kept saying, we don't know where Pilipa is. You better go to Buffalo. So that's the joke about that. So we're open to any questions or anything, comments? My students ask more questions than that.
Sam.
Yeah, what did your parents do when they came to San Diego?
Initially, when they came to San Diego, my mother was a homemaker, and my father, because he'd worked for Ford Motor Company in Buffalo, worked for General Dynamics, and then realized he didn't want to do that and went into business and sales. He would go up to North County and sell merchandise out of the back of his Rambler station wagon to people that worked in the avocado and citrus farms. He got tired of traveling to the North County and did that in Southeast San Diego, and developed enough of a clientele that he opened up a store. It was Fox's Clothing, Furniture, and Appliances. And his slogan was, we came from the east to the west to serve you people the best.
I wish I'd saved that sign. It was great. Yes.
Just a quick comment. I remember when I was a younger boy and man, I should say.
Repeat the question.
He's still telling it.
When the museum, the Holocaust Museum opened in Skokie, Illinois, there was always every day a Holocaust survivor sitting outside at the museum. And of course, now that they're gone, I admire you guys for carrying on the tradition.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Did anybody want us to repeat what was said?
Yeah.
Okay. The gentleman was saying that in Skokie at the museum, there was always, when he was growing up as a young man, that there was always a Holocaust survivor sitting out there. And now, obviously, the population is very limited. I think I read there's only 225,000 in the world. So here in San Diego, we're limited to about 20. So
And when we came to San Diego, there were about 500. So you can see.
Yeah.
And Susie.
I just want to say that I knew your parents. I met them, and they're amazing. They were confident, classy, and compassionate people.
Thank
They
you.
were wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
You know, when my father passed away, sitting at his Shiva, which we do after mourning the death, I was listening to what people were saying about my dad, and I thought, you know, my dad should have been a teacher. He remembered dates, and he remembered places, and he remembered all of that. I mean, he was a historian. So I like to think maybe that's where it came from.
He
That's why I
spoke a
became
number of
teacher.
languages, too.
Yeah, he did. He was very quick on picking up languages.
What's interesting is my father, as my sister said, you say go, and he took off talking. My mother was very reluctant. And it was one day when she was with Sonia at a middle school, sitting at a table talking to some of the children, that she started to open up, and after that began speaking. And we have them recorded on several means. The Shoah Foundation out of the University of Southern California filmed them and interviewed them. We have that. And then Sonia has some tapes where my father was speaking at a school. And also, apparently, some time back, Cox Network or cable here in San Diego had a friend of ours, Diane Strum, who's also the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, interview Holocaust survivors, and we have her interviewing my father.
But what's interesting is that we did not have a video camera. And so I sat my dad down because, as I said, he had all the stories. And I said, Dad, I want to tape you. And I started to tape him. He'd go, wait a minute. I forgot to tell you. And he would, and it was getting so here, there, and everywhere. So I finally said, Dad, when you're at work and it's slow, write it down. Well, he was in this store of his. Every single ad that arrived, he would flip it over and he wrote on the back. I have pages this size, but I finally have taken all of his writing and I've transposed it and it's now on the computer. And I do want to write a book, but I'm struggling with, do I keep it in his voice or do I write it, as a teacher with grammatically correct?
I think you said your mother questioned one day, where is God in all this? Did she ever get an answer?
No. Matter of fact, when we were very young, she did not want to participate in Jewish things at all, even though she was raised from an Orthodox family. And when we came to San Diego, thanks to my cousin, there were 3 synagogues in town. And my mother went to each of them because my dad said, we have children. We have to give them some values and morals, and I want them to be raised Jewish, even though all this had happened. And she went to those synagogues and met with each of the rabbis. And we were at Tifereth, Israel. Rabbi Levins, who was an incredible rabbi and man, he's the one that convinced her that there is a God.
Well, the other thing is the rabbi at the Orthodox synagogue, Rabbi Stern, was a Holocaust survivor, and he kept talking about the Holocaust, and my parents had heard enough. They didn't want to hear more. As a follow-up to the story that Sonia was telling about the notes, when my father passed away and we were going through the property, I found this folder, a thick folder with all these pieces of paper. My mother took copious notes about everything, her experiences. And the same thing, on little pieces of paper, the back of advertisements, my old legal pads, my old pleading paper, and I'm now in the process of putting that into my computer and organizing, and that was the basis for what I talked about my mother. But I have still so much more to go through.
If your father was Aryan looking, what prompted the arrest?
The fact that he was Jewish. They, and even in those times, and I have my mother, on Ancestry, I found my mother's, the census. So they knew in those times they took censuses?
Yeah.
Forget that. Took a census. Anyway, they knew who was in the family, how old you were, and they even knew what the occupations were. Oh. And if it was a child, they'd say, not child, but not working. So they had proof of who everybody was, and you had to have identification cards.
The Germans were meticulous in the records they kept of everything. I have a card that my mother was sent to the infirmary for something in one of the camps. The other thing is it was easy to determine Jewish men because Jewish men were circumcised. So they could determine you that way. Susie.
As children, did you feel safe? How did your parents' experiences, how did you feel in yourself as people growing up here?
Well, people who know me, I was a good girl. I did not want to cause any problems or pain to my parents, so that was an objective of mine. Was I scared? Never, but we did have a situation one time right here in La Jolla. We would go every Sunday to La Jolla Cove. Our parents would all have blankets and they would have food and they'd play cards. And our dads got up to play soccer, which they weren't playing soccer here yet. And I remember when my dad would take his shirt off and be like, Dad, this is America. They don't play soccer. They play baseball here. But they would do this. But one day, and correct me if a flatbed truck showed up. And there were brown shirts, Nazis, with a big swastika flag.
Young adults.
Yeah. And for me, I was about 12. It scared me to death. I thought, they're here. They've come for us. And that was pre-cell phone days, but luckily somebody went across the street to one of the hotels and called the police. But I have to tell you, our parents were amazing. They all stood up, did not let anything happen. And we're not sure who did what, but either my mother grabbed the flag and somebody else sat on it, or vice versa. But I was so proud of them that they were not going to let something like this ever happen again.
Also, growing up, our parents belonged to what was called the New Life Club, which is an organization of Holocaust survivors. And we as children belonged to the Junior New Life Club. So we were together. We had no families. These were our families. And we would gather on different occasions and be together. So for me, it was a comfort level. I didn't have any fear in the community because I had, Sue and Rachel and other people that I grew up with, and Sam. I mean, we'd play sports together. That was our life at those days.
They created family. We did not have grandparents, aunts or uncles or cousins, but they created family. And they were comfortable with all the survivors. And so we got to know all the children extremely well. We all grew up together.
And a lot of us now belong to the second generation group that Sam's involved with.
Have you been on the March of the Living?
Yes. We went
We went together.
7 years ago, the year that Israel was 70 years old. And we went to Poland and spent a week there, and to Auschwitz, Majdanek, and what was left of the Warsaw Ghetto, and then to Israel for a week. It was an interesting story. My father was from a city in Poland called Sosnowiec. And the bus is driving by and I see a sign that says Sosnowiec, but it's not on the German border. And so I asked one of our guides, and he said, I don't know. We have another city. Then later, my brother's son, his in-laws, we meet them and they say, they're from Sosnowiec, but it's on the Russian border. So I go and look it up, and it turns out there's 8 cities in Poland named Sosnowiec.
But your father's from the same one, and your mother's from the same one.
Yeah.
But for me, going to Auschwitz, it was very, very eerie.
Yeah.
I kept wondering, had my mother walked here? Had she been in this building? She never told me barracks numbers or anything, so I didn't know that. But we were there at a time that was extremely hot, and they had told us it was going to be cold. They gave us umbrellas and jackets. I even bought boots that to this day I call them my Polish boots because they were fur-lined. And here we were walking, hot, uncomfortable, and I was with a friend, and we said, I wonder if they have water or are there bathrooms? And we went, what are we saying? Our parents didn't have that, and here how spoiled we were that we were thinking of our comforts. So it was a very, very eerie experience.
Last year when we went, it was the first time that it was torrential rain, and it was the same kind of feeling. They canceled the whole program after we got to it. And walking back, it was the same thing. We're walking in the mud, it's torrential rain and hail, no locusts like frogs, but everything else. But then it dawned and it resonated even deeper because we were going to a bus. We were then going back to a hotel for being fed. And it just was chilling and resonated so deeply down to the core.
Right. And they're museums now, and they're far nicer than they were in that time. I mean, you would look and say, oh, there's grass, there's flowers. They could have eaten that. That didn't exist then.
In Auschwitz, they have a room called the Book of Names. And it's like maps from floor to ceiling. And we looked up our family. And what disturbed me the most is most of the members of the family, according to the records that they had, were killed in 1945 before the war ended. The other thing that was really eerie about being at Auschwitz, the Germans destroyed the crematorium, and we're standing there and they're talking about it, and all of a sudden we see black smoke coming overhead.
It was a fire.
There was a fire at a tire plant in the city of Auschwitz, but here you are standing at the crematorium, and then you see the black smoke. It was very eerie. Yes?
There's a young girl there too.
Oh, where?
Right there.
Yeah. Go ahead, and then we'll get you.
How old were both of your parents when they were liberated?
Hold what?
How old they were when they liberated? My dad was about 26. He was older, and Mom was 19.
19.
What's a lesson that you find most important to pass on when you talk to this generation?
That's a good one. Mostly that, you know, anything that happens, you can get through it. Persevere through it and have hope and gratitude. They say that gratitude alone is enough that keeps people going. So when we talk to the students, we tell them, so you had a bad day today. Shrug it off. You know, tomorrow will be a better day. And our parents used to say that a lot too. You know, tomorrow has to be better. Tomorrow will be better.
And for me, it's never forget. People need to understand that, you know, there are other Holocausts that are occurring and have occurred that you need to be aware of and have concern for and do something about. Not just what happened back in the 1945 with the Nazis.
But what's interesting, in the classroom, the kids are starting to make correlations to what's happening politically around the world.
Sandy.
Well, I knew your parents and just really thought a lot of them, respected them a lot. And I just think, I know they'd be very proud of you.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you.
The Jewish Federation is, it's interesting. The Goldberg families donated a lot of money, and they built this, what would you call it, a virtual?
Well, it was supposed to be a bus. Now it's more like a container, a large, on wheels.
Yeah, and it's going to be all digital and video to see the history, and I think they're going to emphasize stories and the history of local Holocaust survivors, but also the history of the Holocaust. And they're in May, they're going to
May
dedicate
3rd.
it, and it'll be taken to schools and other locations where you can literally walk inside and touch things and learn about different things. It's going to be very interesting. Yes?
That sounds like the movie Paperclips.
Well, that's her organization that idea started her organization.
Sam's wife was teaching at the Jewish Academy and was a little concerned because, and we even heard this yesterday when we were at the Academy, that Jewish parents are protective, don't want their children to hear these horrible stories. And so Jan wanted to do something. She created the Butterfly Project, and it came from Paperclips. I had the opportunity to go to I forget the name, Whitwell, Tennessee. And I was there and I experienced it. I met the principal and we had the kids present to us. If you've not seen the documentary, I highly recommend it. It's called Paperclips.
Explain what the Butterfly Project is.
The Butterfly Project, my arm got twisted by your wife to do this, but I do love every minute of it. It's an organization that was created by Jan Landau, where we go into the schools and we teach, and Bob Gantz is also one of our speakers. And what they do after we speak, they paint ceramic butterflies, and those butterflies go on the walls of schools, mosques, churches, synagogues, and it's a reminder. And we tell the students, it's to remember what happened in the past, how are you going to behave in the present, and what are you going to do to make the world a better place? And so we're, as Jan says, the Butterfly Project has flown to every single state. It's in 25 countries, and it's even in Germany, and I saw it when we were in Poland. So it has been everywhere. If you want to see more about it, it's thebutterflyprojectnow.org, and you can see what we're doing with that.
Yes.
Was your father ever able to reconnect with the Russian gentleman who assisted him?
No,
Wow.
he did not. And what's interesting is when we do our lessons, we talk about the righteous among the nations, all these wonderful non-Jews and Jews that save people. And he said that was his biggest regret, was that he didn't know his last name and that he lost the picture, on his way back home. And so he did not know who he was. But I always say his name, Alex, to honor him.
What the righteous among the living is
Nations.
a nation. The Holocaust Museum in Israel, Yad Vashem, based on information they're given by people, honor non-Jews who have tried to save Jews. And it's interesting because they have stones and trees dedicated to these people if you go there. But
Only 27,000. So when you think about all the people that were murdered, 6 million Jews, 5 million others, of which 1.5 million were innocent children, there was only 27,000 people that stood up to help. Sam, are we talking too much?
Thank you again.
If you'd like to come up and see the uniform up close, I'll have it spread out on the table over here.
Look at this photograph. Every time I do, it makes me laugh. Every time I